Good evening, everyone. I'm Scott Stevenson. I'm the president and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution. Welcome to all of our old friends. I recognize many familiar faces in the audience, but as I always do, could we have a show of hands for anyone who's here for the first time tonight in the museum? All right. Well, a warm welcome to you. I love that percentage of new visitors is shrinking as we go year to year, as we enter our third year of operations here at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. Before I introduce my good friend and tonight's speaker, Stephen Brumwell, just wanted to do a little advertisement for some upcoming programs that I know you'll want to come for. February 12th, coming up, Vincent Brown, a professor of history at Harvard. Any of you who were at our opening on April 19th of 2017 will remember Vince as an absolute electrifying speaker among our keynote speakers that day. And he is incredibly accomplished. He was also in the recent CBS Sunday morning piece about the museum. And so as a dear friend returning again, on February 12th to speak about his hot off the press book on Tacky's Rebellion. This is looking at Jamaica and slave rebellion and the larger context of resistance to slavery in the Atlantic in the 18th century. So really cutting edge research. It's going to be really a fabulous talk. Caitlin Fitz will be here on May 19th, and she'll be speaking about the relationship between the early republic and the Latin American nations that were struggling for independence in their early years of the 19th century, late 18th century, and that will be an absolutely fabulous talk as well. Now, I hope most of you have enjoyed the Cost of Revolution, our special exhibition, the museum's first international loan exhibition that opened at the end of September. You just have about 6 weeks left. It's going to go through St. Patrick's Day appropriately, as it is subtitled The Life and Death of an Irish Soldier. And on March 5th, which by the way is the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, we'll be having Martin Marone from the Tate Britain, who'll be over speaking about from Gainsborough to Gothic nightmares, and he'll be kind of talking about the artworks that have been pulled together for the Cost of Revolution exhibition. So you won't want to miss that as well. Now, for tonight's event, my dear friend Stephen Brumwell, a native of Portsmouth in England. Stephen is one of the most engaging, accomplished public historians that's practicing, I think, the craft today. Part of that is, I think, because he spent a good bit of time as a newspaper reporter and a journalist. And so if any of you have read any of his works, and he specialized on the 18th century, he's written a lot of topics about the British Army in North America and the French and Indian War. He's written a wonderful book about Robert Rogers and his Rangers, the subject of that great Spencer Tracy film, Northwest Passage. He's written a fantastic book that won the Washington Book Prize about George Washington, gentleman warrior, and is a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal as a book reviewer. So Stephen was a mature student, went to Leeds University in Yorkshire in England, actually arrived there as a student just about a year after I left as an undergraduate student for a year at Leeds, got his PhD there, and has just, like I say, just been fabulous. And one of the things I've always appreciated about Stephen is he's an incredible storyteller and an electrifying speaker. And so please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Stephen Brumwell.
Well, thank you very much, Scott, for that very generous build-up. Hopefully, I'll try and live up to it. Now, I just wanted to start by saying how much I've enjoyed the Museum of the American Revolution, which I had a chance to look around this afternoon. I'd never been here before, and I really was extremely impressed with the way the story of the revolution is told here, just how engaging and how vivid things are presented. The artifacts really are showcased in a way which I think really does bring them alive for visitors of all ages. And the current exhibition as well, Cost of Revolution, very impressive indeed. So I think that everyone involved with the museum deserves congratulations for the great job they're doing. And I hope that the museum will continue to thrive. Now, today I'm going to be talking about Benedict Arnold, if I can get rid of my face, and replace it with a boot, which I will talk about later. But I'm going to be talking about Benedict Arnold, and it was quite interesting. I was coming through customs in Dublin, where they now have pre-clearance if you're coming to America from Europe. And as I was going through immigration, the young American chap on the booth said, "Well, Stephen, why are you coming to America?" "Oh, I'm going to be giving a talk." "What's it about?" "Benedict Arnold." He went, "Cool." And said, have a good trip. And I thought, oh. So I was quite surprised. But what I found interesting about that encounter was the fact that this chap, I guess he was probably in his late 20s, knew immediately who Benedict Arnold was. And there was that kind of recognition. And Benedict Arnold, if we can, there we go. Now, Benedict Arnold, the name resonates. It's now 240 years since Arnold's great act of treason. But it's something which still resonates today. And this is quite interesting. If you look at, I don't know if you can read the date, but this is Harper's Weekly, a magazine from September 29th, 1860. In less than a year. 1860. 1860 on the side. Yeah, on the side, yeah. 1780 at the bottom, yeah. So less than a year after this print came out, the American Civil War was underway. And yet, if you want to reference treason, and if you want to evoke this idea of going against the Union, who do you pick on? You pick on Benedict Arnold. And Arnold, of course, is here on the right, and Major John Andre is shown on the left. Arnold here is the very sort of personification of evil and treachery. And just in case you didn't get the message, there's a serpent coiled around the branch. So really, it's when I saw that image, I thought I had to use it because it does kind of sum up, if you like, the way that Arnold resonates. And even today, in the current political climate in America, both Republicans and Democrats in the past few years have used the name Benedict Arnold when they're bandying around allegations of treason. So, Arnold still has the power to shock. So what I want to try and do in the relatively short time we've got available tonight is to tease out some of the backgrounds and some of the more controversial themes. I look at all of this in detail in my book, so I'm not going to go into too much about the particular evidence. I just want to get at some of the key ideas and some of the key themes to try and understand why Arnold's treason bequeathed him such enduring notoriety. So, who was Benedict Arnold? Well, he was born in Norwich, Connecticut in 1741. And that's quite significant because in that same year, a combined force of British and colonial American troops went off to Cartagena on the Isthmus of Panama to besiege the Spanish fortress there. That was a war that would morph into what was known as the War of the Austrian Succession, with a distinctive American offshoot, which was known as King George's War. Now, this was the last in a succession of conflicts which had gone on between Britain and its European enemies, each of which had spawned a kind of a little colonial offshoot. So you have King William's War, Queen Anne's War. And Arnold's teenage years coincided with the greatest of these colonial conflicts, which we know as the French and Indian War. Now, there's some debate as to what involvement Arnold actually had in this war. You can read in some books that Arnold ran away from his apprenticeship in Connecticut to join the New York provincials to go and fight the French. But what seems far more likely is that he actually joined the local Norwich militia, which was mustered when the French invaded from Canada, took Fort William Henry, and this is the famous episode shown written about in The Last of the Mohicans, and then shown in the various film versions. So Arnold matured in an era when the French were the natural hereditary enemies of all Britons, no matter which side of the Atlantic they lived on. Oh, sorry, gone back the wrong way. There we are. Now, this is actually an item which is on display in the museum here, and this is a tavern sign which shows General James Wolfe, who was known as Wolfe as Quebec. He was a British general who ended up fighting the French, beating the French, capturing Quebec, which was seen as a big pivotal victory in the war. Now, interestingly enough, this tavern was run by a chap called Israel Putnam, who went on to become a Revolutionary War general. But the interesting thing is, of course, in the 1760s, when Putnam was running this tavern, Britain and its American colonies had never been closer. They'd just come through this war with France, which they'd won. And Putnam, when he was looking for someone to put on his tavern, decided to use one of the great British American heroes of that war. So during the 1760s, Arnold made his way as a merchant. He started out as a shopkeeper, but he was obviously a rather more adventurous spirit, because then he became a sea captain and a trader. And he travelled extensively through what historians like to call the British Atlantic world. So he's plying back and forth across the Atlantic, often in fairly small vessels. And he goes to London, and recently I was interested to discover he also went to Amsterdam, where I live now, and he also travelled to Canada, sometimes by ship, sometimes overland, and he used to bring back herds of wild horses from Canada, bring them across the frozen Lake Champlain, Lake George. So he was also known as a horse trader, and in his later years he was sometimes referred to as a jockey, which he always used to laugh about. He wasn't actually a jockey, that was just another reference to the fact he was a horse trader. So he was someone who had this kind of fairly tough, outward-going existence. During these same years, Arnold was amongst those who started to get a bit riled at the British legislation which was being introduced, which basically was trying to get the American colonies to help pay off the debt of the war, which the British had invested a lot of money and blood in to win in terms of getting the French out of Canada. Now, despite economic ups and downs during this period, Arnold clearly prospered, and by 1771, he'd acquired enough wealth to build the grandest mansion in New Haven, where he was living, and to aspire to the refined lifestyle and title of a gentleman. But despite this, he did have his grievances with what the British were doing. For example, the Boston Massacre that Scott referred to earlier, which happened in 1770. He saw that as a great act of tyranny. But despite these kind of views, he's actually done pretty well under the British system. Try and get this there. There we go. Oh, sorry, gone too far. When the fighting actually started in 1775, Arnold, interestingly, and this is, I think, important to bear in mind, he actually really thrust himself forward in the patriot cause. He was one of the very first to actually take up arms. He played an important role alongside Ethan Allen in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. And this was very important because the guns from Fort Ticonderoga were brought down to Boston, where George Washington was besieging the British, and they were instrumental in getting the British out of Boston. So in what became something of a pattern, Arnold felt that he hadn't really been given proper recognition for what he'd done. Most of the credit for this went to Ethan Allen. So he thought his efforts had been overlooked. Now, it's clear that Arnold was an unusually determined individual. He was someone who wasn't discouraged by adversity, and he had what we'd now call a positive can-do attitude. A prime example of this, I think, sorry, can you hear me? Or is that okay? A prime example was the expedition that he led against Quebec through the Maine wilderness in the winter of 1775. This was a distance of 270 miles with the prospect of a fight at the end of it. So despite appalling conditions, harsh terrain, sickness amongst his men, desertion of some of the men he had with him, and a chronic lack of supplies, Arnold pushed on through everything to reach his objective. And he was wounded on the night of the last day of 1775 during the same attack in which General Richard Montgomery, shown here in this print from the painting by Trumbull, was killed. Now, I think it's highly likely that if the course of Arnold's career during the Revolutionary War had been different, he would have ended up being featured in this kind of painting, this kind of image. He would have been one of the great icons of the Revolutionary era. Now, we don't have something like that, but here is an image of Arnold, and there's no suggestion that this is actually a likeness of Arnold. But I think what is significant is the fact that this is a London-based print, and already you can see that Colonel Arnold, who commanded the provincial troops, that's what the British called the American troops, and the patriot troops, I should say, the early stage of war, who led the expedition to Quebec. So already in early 1776, Arnold is sufficiently well known that the British press, or the British media, if you like, are using him as a way of making money. Now, even though the Patriot siege of Quebec failed, Arnold's determination was widely recognised, and his performance prompted Congress to promote him from colonel to brigadier general, while Arnold's admirers included the commander-in-chief, George Washington himself. And even after Arnold's treason, veterans who'd survived the march to Quebec were proud to recall it when they applied to Congress for their pensions for the Revolutionary War service. This feat was the foundation of Arnold's reputation as a leading patriot general. And it goes too far, I think, to explain why his subsequent decision to turn his coat created such a sensation. Now, I've already said that this really is just a sort of a generic print. It could be any officer from that period. Here is a likeness of Arnold actually taken from the flesh whilst he was in Philadelphia. And this is the only image we have of Arnold, a likeness, I should say, of Arnold, taken when he was actually serving in the Continental Army. And, of course, it's only a head and shoulders, but we know that Arnold was like this kind of stockily built individual who was known as something of an athlete. He was a very fine horseman, like Washington, and he was also renowned as being apparently the finest skater in New England, where he would skate upon the frozen ponds. So he was someone who prized his ability to be physical. That was very important to him. And also, another character aspect of Arnold was that he was utterly fearless. He possessed the physical courage that was essential for a combat officer, and which was especially important in the 18th century, where conspicuous displays of gallantry, or in fact the opposite, were linked to a man's personal reputation, or what in the 18th century was called his honor. And this was something, again, that was very important to Arnold. Arnold's aggressive style of leadership and both American and British commentators refer to it as intrepidity, had a major influence upon the outcome of the Revolutionary War. I'll just give you a couple of examples, but one from the fall of 1776 was his willingness to take on a far superior British fleet at Valcour Island on Lake Champlain. Basically, the fact that Arnold was willing to fight at all meant that the British in Canada had to build a freshwater fleet of their own. And that took several precious weeks. Arnold, when the fleets clashed, was defeated. And indeed, he was heavily criticised at the time and has been since for needlessly throwing away the American flotilla. But his stand allowed time for the Patriot forces to upgrade, I should say, the fortifications of Fort Ticonderoga. When the British came down the lake and they saw Fort Ticonderoga, they thought, well, no, hang on, it's too late in the season to tackle such a formidable defence. We're going to have to go back. And the timing of this was momentous, because at the very same time, George Washington had been badly defeated on Manhattan and Long Island, forced across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. And if the British Army in Canada had been allowed to continue its path south, Washington would have been trapped between the British advancing from New York and the British coming down from Canada. There wouldn't have been Trenton, there wouldn't have been Princeton, probably would have been the end of the Revolution. So Arnold, I think, although he doesn't often get it, deserves some credit for that. Now, oh God. Sorry, my thumbs are obviously too big for the device. This is a very interesting, very rare print, which comes from the Keeler Tavern Museum in Ridgefield in Connecticut. Washington recognized that Arnold had natural leadership qualities. These were something which were especially important when you've got an army which is composed of many men who haven't previously been soldiers. And one of the things that Arnold had the ability to do was to inspire the militia. So they're not even regular soldiers like the Continentals, they're kind of amateur part-time soldiers. In April 1777, the British invaded Connecticut, Arnold's home state. And Arnold was instrumental in rallying the militia, who eventually ended up driving them back to their ships. And one of the major confrontations in this series of engagements took place at Ridgefield. And this print, interestingly enough, this is a British print from 1780. This is from before Arnold's treason. And there's Arnold there. And this print is based on accounts that were in both the British and American newspapers. During the fighting at Ridgefield, Arnold's horse was shot from under him. He was trapped beneath his horse. A British soldier advanced to bayonet him. Arnold pulled his pistols, shot the British soldier, or provincial maybe. Then, not content with that, he calmly unbuckled his saddle, slung it over his shoulder, and then walked back, kind of bring it on sort of thing. And the British were so impressed with this show of kind of gallantry that Arnold's his reputation in their estimation went right up. This is why, when the British are making prints of the Revolutionary War, Arnold is a popular figure. It's quite interesting. This print actually shows elements of paintings. This figure at the bottom there originally appeared in a portrait of George II at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. So the printmaker did his nice little original piece there, but most of these other figures are basically lifted from completely irrelevant prints and paintings. And he's cut and pasted, if you like, an image. So I found that quite curious. But that same incident, once again, Congress took note of Arnold's fighting spirit, and they raised him to Major General. But the great problem was that earlier that year, they had already they created 5 other Major Generals, and Ivan's seniority was below these men, even though, not least in his own estimation, his value to the cause as a fighting officer was far higher. This was something that really rankled with him and would become a bit of a kind of a sore point. Now that summer, the same summer of the summer of 1777, the British resumed their invasion from Canada, the same move that Arnold had helped to stall the previous year. And this time under General John Burgoyne. Once again, it was Arnold's feisty frontline style of leadership that was crucial in transforming what was basically a kind of a defensive standoff into a decisive Patriot victory. And it was Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga in October that led to the direct French intervention in the war as military allies of the Patriots, bringing in eventually French troops, but also, perhaps more importantly, French warships. And without these, the outcome of the Revolutionary War would have been very different. At Saratoga, Arnold suffered his second serious combat wound. He'd been badly wounded at Quebec in the left leg. Saratoga, he received another wound which was far worse. It really shattered his leg, and there was talk that his leg should have been amputated, but he resisted that. But it meant that he was laid up for several months, brooding over various issues, including why hadn't Congress promoted him to his correct rank. Well, eventually Congress did. And because Arnold was now effectively crippled, couldn't even ride a horse anymore, he was appointed to be the military governor here in Philadelphia. So it's very interesting. I was walking around this morning, and many of the places, like the reconstructed City Tavern, these are places where Arnold, would have drunk, where Arnold would have been. And there's Christchurch. Arnold would have been in Christchurch. Of course, so would so many of the famous figures of the Revolutionary era. But I think it gives a particular connection to this talk. But for Arnold, Philadelphia, when George Washington gave Arnold the Philadelphia command, he thought he was doing him a favor, but it turned out to be a poisoned chalice. It was the worst possible place for a man of Arnold's temperament to be placed. Philadelphia was a divided city. It had just recently been occupied by the British for a year or so. So although some of the hardcore loyalists, those who really did commit themselves to King George, had left when the British evacuated Philadelphia, there were still people around who'd basically been what you might call, depending on your perspective, collaborators, people who'd got along with the British. They'd made money off the back of the British occupation. So it was a city that was riven by suspicion, factions. And Arnold, in comes this proud, headstrong soldier. And at this period, you've got, amongst civilians, there's this great suspicion of soldiers, even though these are the ones who are actually fighting for your liberty. There's this tradition of fearing the standing army. What happens if soldiers get too powerful? What happened in England after the English Civil War, after King Charles I lost his head? Oliver Cromwell's new model army came in, set up military rule. So there was this fear of standing armies, which was kind of inherited from the British tradition, from the English tradition. And another thing which counted against Arnold was the fact that I've already mentioned that he was someone who was kind of fond of the kind of high living you associate with a gentleman. So when he came to Philadelphia, he had a carriage, which of course you could perhaps excuse him as someone who couldn't actually walk because of his wound, but he had liveried servants, he liked going to the theatre, and he was fond of high living. All this kind of behaviour was frowned upon by the Philadelphia radicals, the more radical Republicans, who had a more austere version, had an idea of what the revolutionary cause should be like. So before too long, Arnold had basically rubbed up the wrong way several key figures, one of whom was Joseph Reed, who went on to become the president of Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council. That this was a body which was so radical and so sensitive that it was actually in conflict with Congress. So you had a kind of a scenario where Arnold is being put into this situation where there's already an existing ferment of interest before he's even put into the equation. And he starts to rile up people by engaging in some fairly dubious business ventures. By the standards of the time, they weren't really that outrageous, but people who disliked him for other reasons seized upon this as ammunition. And Arnold began to get the feeling that he was somehow being persecuted. Now, Arnold, during his time in Philadelphia, Arnold lived in the Master's Pen house, which was a mansion on what is now Market Street. Well, actually, it was also Market Street then, but of course, the house he lived in, which was subsequently used as a residence by George Washington and John Adams when they were presidents, sadly has been demolished. But there are other buildings in Philadelphia. This is Woodford, which is on the outskirts, near the Schuylkill. Is that the correct pronunciation? Thank you, the lady who informed me earlier on. Is a similar building house from the same period. This is actually a side view. Unfortunately, I don't have the front, but it gives you an idea of the sort of the grand mansions, the sort of places that someone like Arnold wanted to live in. This was actually occupied. The resident for the early part of the Revolutionary War was a chap called David Franks, who had been a supplier of goods to the British Army during the French and Indian War. And at the start of the Revolutionary War, he was, Congress gave him the job of feeding British prisoners of war who'd been taken in the course of the conflict. But this is another example of how divided things were in Philadelphia. When the Revolutionary War progressed, Franks came under suspicion because of his previous Crown sympathies. And Benedict Arnold, ironically, was required to go and arrest him for treason. So during the Revolutionary War, this place, Woodford, is somewhere where not only during the British occupation, it was somewhere that William Howe, the British general who commanded the army at that time, used to like going with his staff, including captain at that time, John Andre. It was also a place where Franks's daughter, Rebecca, used to have a social circle, which was very friendly, socializing with the British Army. Rebecca went on to marry a British officer, and one of their two sons, actually, was killed at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Now, Woodford was one of a series of mansions in that area on the outskirts of Philadelphia. Another was Mount Pleasant, and this was a property that Benedict Arnold purchased as a wedding gift for his second wife, Peggy Shippen, although they never actually lived there. Now, Peggy was a close friend of Rebecca Franks, and like her, had enjoyed the company of British officers during the Crown's occupation of Philadelphia. But Peggy, she had various family connections her father, Edward Shippen, unlike David Frank, Rebecca Frank's father, he was someone who managed to kind of steer an even course during the Revolution, managed to, despite being someone who was kind of suspected of having loyalist sympathies, managed to somehow weather the storms of the times and to keep his position and his standing. And Peggy, you can see this is actually a drawing, a watercolor made from a drawing by John Andre. So Peggy obviously knew Andre well enough to sit for him, to have her likeness drawn. She was just 18 years old when Benedict Arnold, who was twice her age at that stage, began courting her in Philadelphia. She married Arnold in April 1779. Arnold first approached the British in May 1779, a month later. So this begs the question, what role did Peggy play in initiating Benedict Arnold's decision to turn to the British? Now, Peggy clearly had links with John Andre, who would go on to become an important figure in Arnold's treason. But while I've no doubt that Peggy was subsequently involved in her husband's treason, I've not found any hard evidence that she actually guided him down the path to treason, that she was like what you might call a sort of a Lady Macbeth type figure who was pushing Benedict Arnold in a certain way. So this leads to the central question of Arnold's extraordinary career. Why did one of the Patriots' most effective fighters, who'd been crippled in the cause of American liberty, decide to change his allegiance? Now, his horrified contemporaries just assumed that he'd been corrupted by greed for British gold. And later historians have acknowledged this factor, but they also emphasize the resentment that Arnold felt at the lack of recognition he believed he'd been given by Congress for his achievements, and what seemed like the vindictive vendettas that were waged against him by people like Joseph Reed, who really just seemed to be out for their own personal reasons, sorry about that, to tarnish his good name. Now, there's no doubt that Arnold was obsessed by his personal reputation, by his honour. But that poses another linked question. Why would a man who cared about honour so much do something which would be deemed to be so utterly dishonourable? Arnold first approached the British, as I said, in May 1779, and he did so via an emissary, a London-born Philadelphia shopkeeper called Jonathan Stansbury. He ran a china shop on Front Street. Now, Stansbury was interviewed by Sir Henry Clinton's popular young aide, Captain John Andre, in New York. From Andre's totally flabbergasted reaction, it's clear that Arnold's offer to defect was totally unexpected. So this undermines the theory that Mrs. Peggy Arnold, the former Peggy Shippen, and her old friend, perhaps boyfriend, John Andre, had conspired to turn the celebrated general away from his patriot cause. So there's no evidence that Arnold was somehow seduced by a British agent. This was his own decision. But I think Arnold must have been mulling this over for some time. I don't think he suddenly decided in April 1779, right, I've had enough of this, I'm going to go over to the British. I think he must have been mulling this over for certainly a matter of several months. Now, the British were well aware of Arnold's frustrations at the way he was being treated. And it's possible he was seen as a man who it was worth watching, someone who might potentially in the future be persuaded to defect. While there's no evidence of any direct approach to Arnold before he contacted the British himself, one loyalist spy, who's a very remarkable figure in her own right, this is a woman called Anne Bates, who'd run a school here in Philadelphia. She later recalled being sent on a mission to Pennsylvania to what she describes as a friend who was in connection with General Arnold. Now, given the timing of this trip, which was the autumn of 1778, this may have been an effort to gauge Arnold's support for British peace proposals, the so-called Carlisle Commission, which were being made at this time. This was a last-ditch effort by the British to try and persuade the Patriots to accept a negotiated settlement before the French came into the war wholeheartedly, and which Arnold later maintained had been a reasonable offer. Sir Henry Clinton reminded Arnold that when he first offered his services to the British, that he'd done so for what he described as the delivery or deliverance, if you want to phrase it that way, of his country. By siding with the British and helping them to administer a knockout blow to Washington and the hard-pressed Continental Army, he would save the Patriots from a corrupt and dysfunctional Congress. and end the horrors of what he now considered to be a futile and bloody civil war. Now, this was a drastic move, but as one British general, James Robertson, who came to know Arnold very well, later recalled, Arnold was a man who didn't do things by halves. Arnold was driven by an unswerving belief that he was in the right. A phrase which comes up again and again in his correspondence is conscious of the rectitude of my intentions. Whatever anyone else thought, by turning to the British, Arnold truly believed that he acted in the best interests of his countrymen. Of course, he would expect to be compensated for his efforts by a grateful monarch. And early on, when he first approached Clinton, he talks about remuneration, compensation. He's not talking about 20,000 guineas for handing over West Point. He's talking about being compensated for the cost of the property he's actually going to be giving up when he goes over to the British, should the British not win the war. I think there's a very significant point here, which we tend to forget because we associate Arnold with the great treason of 1780, offering to hand over West Point. But Arnold defected in 1779. He made the offer to defect, I should say, in 1779. I think the timing of this is very important. In 1779, it wasn't as if British fortunes were at their high point. The British had just evacuated Philadelphia. They were having to regroup because the French were entering the war. So it wasn't as if it was obvious that the British were going to win. So I think this supports the argument, which I try and make in my book, that Arnold's decision was motivated essentially, or most importantly, I should say, by ideological reasons. He actually believed that he was doing the right thing. Now, Sir Henry Clinton also recalled that from the outset, the very beginning, not after the treason, but from the very beginning, Arnold had expressed his intense dislike of the French alliance, a pact that went against the instincts of many Americans, for whom the French were the traditional enemy. Arnold consistently maintained this ideological justification long after he might have been expected to feel that it no longer even mattered. In 1792, 12 years after his treason was exposed, he fought a duel with an English lord who suggested that Arnold had behaved for dishonourable reasons. So, although this will sound a little ironic, I'd argue that Arnold had a strong sense of patriotism as an American. This was just as true after he changed sides, as while he was risking his life in the cause of American liberty. Whatever anyone else might have thought, Arnold, who was proud of his American birth, was convinced that he'd acted honourably and from the most patriotic of motives. Of course, as he backed the wrong side, and history tends to be written by the winners, that claim has never been taken seriously. Now, I realise I've got a fairly limited amount, so I'm going to try and move through the rest of the presentation a little bit more quickly. Now, when Arnold's treason came to light on the morning of 25th September 1780, no one was more shocked than George Washington. Here he's shown as a kind of a lean and active 48-year-old in the year of the treason, 1780. And in the background, you can see Billy Lee, his slave valet. And also in the background, this is the Hudson Highlands, this is the Hudson River, and that may even meant to be a representation of West Point. Now, Arnold was a great admirer, Washington was a great admirer of Arnold, although Arnold, interestingly, was a great admirer of Washington as well. And Washington had served his own military apprenticeship decades earlier as a soldier of the crown, a soldier of the king. He'd wanted nothing more than a commission from King George himself, although, of course, that never happened. So when he subsequently rebelled against King George III in 1775, Washington was a traitor. So, of course, was Arnold. Arnold was a two-time traitor, if you want to look at it that way. So, interestingly, the signers of the Declaration of Independence did so under the assumption that they had nooses around their necks and they could potentially be hanged for treason. But the British never punished the rebels, if I can call them that, as a Briton myself, as traitors, not as they had done, for example, the Jacobites in 1746, and as the Irish rebels in 1798. So the bonds between the mother country and what was still seen as a kind of erring colonial children was still too strong for that kind of behaviour. So Washington, seen here against the background of the Hudson Highlands. Why were the Hudson Highlands so important? Well, the Hudson Highlands, which is kind of this band of sort of mountainous terrain on the Hudson above New York and below Albany, were important because basically the only way through them was the Hudson River. And the Hudson River was what connected the British in Canada with the British in New York. If you could gain control of the Hudson, you would split the rebellion, the American rebellion as the British saw it. Not only that, but you would disrupt the supply line for the Continental Army, which ran via King's Ferry, which is several miles below West Point. So if the British could capture the Hudson Highlands, then potentially that would end the war. But to capture the Hudson Highlands, you had to capture West Point. And from the summer of 1780, West Point had been entrusted to Benedict Arnold, who had been lobbying for the command of West Point for some time, because by then the British, negotiating with Arnold, had seen him, the best possible service that Arnold could perform to the British was to somehow orchestrate handing over West Point to the British. That was what they'd identified as the most useful thing he could do. Now, the linchpin of the Hudson Highlands was West Point, and here we have a panorama painted by a French officer, 1782. So this gives you a very good idea of the most important thing about West Point. The fortifications now, because of the military academy there, you've got these great towering buildings that look more like a medieval castle, which are huge in scale. But at the time, the fortifications were low-lying. You can hardly see them on this. But they were low-lying because they were designed to be as inconspicuous as possible to artillery. And you have a chain of forts. You also have redouts, small self-contained forts on the opposite side of the Hudson River. To give you a sense of the scale, here we have a warship. And what makes West Point so important, you can see how there's this notch in the mountains going through, and there's this real kink in the river. It's like an elbow bend. So for a warship to get round West Point, it's often going to have the wind against it. It's going to inevitably have to slow down. And there was also a chain across the river to physically block the river to the passage of shipping. So to actually storm West Point in a conventional siege would be very difficult. So to get West Point, the British were very interested in this idea of, okay, let's obtain West Point somehow, let's do it through collaboration with Benedict Arnold. Now, how realistic was the plan to capture West Point? Because the plan ultimately failed, as we all know, I think people don't really look at whether it could actually have worked. But I'd suggest that it had a very good chance of working. As originally conceived, Sir Henry Clinton, who was still Commander-in-Chief of the British in New York, intended to wait until Washington and his French allies made a joint attack on New York. As they approached Manhattan, Arnold would surrender his command, which would make Washington kind of recoil to try and recover West Point, so leaving the French in the lurch. Clinton would then eliminate the French. But all this changed because on September the 14th, 1780, Sir George Rodney, sorry, a bit of a tongue twister, arrived at New York with a British fleet, which changed the balance of sea power in favour of the British. Now, that meant that Washington was no longer likely to attack New York. So Sir Henry decided to activate his long-held plan to take West Point instead. The timing was very favourable because that summer had been a very bad one for the Patriot cause. Charleston, South Carolina, had been captured by the British. And Horatio Gates, who'd commanded at Saratoga, had been roundly defeated by the British under Charles Cornwallis at the Battle of Camden, also in the South. So Patriot fortunes were at low ebb. There was also crippling inflation. The continental dollar was virtually worthless. The army was hungry. A lot of men had been serving for years. They just wanted to go home. The war was kind of bogged down. It seemed like it was in a stalemate. And most crucially, from Clinton's point of view, he'd already assembled a task force of 3,000 men who were intended to go to Chesapeake Bay under General Sir Alexander Leslie. These men were already aboard transport ships off New York. They were ready to go. So what Clinton decided to do was to use those men instead to go up the Hudson and take West Point. Now, these could actually get up the Hudson pretty much in a single tide because at New York there's a very powerful surge of the flood tide, which is capable of getting vessels up a far distance in a short space of time. Other British troops were put on alert. The elite light infantry, grenadiers, the Hessian Jaegers, they were on standby to back up the first wave, if you want to look at it that way. And so everything was ready. But the problem was there was an element of doubt in Clinton's mind. I just quickly want to show you this slide. This isn't the Hudson, this is actually the Siege of Quebec in 1759. But this gives you an idea of British amphibious capacity, the fact that they were actually, this was what the British were good at, amphibious operations. They'd already, earlier in the Revolutionary War, landed troops without losing a single man. Thousands of men on Long Island, Rhode Island. They'd used amphibious forces in the South. Here you see basically transport ships, warships, two-deckers, frigates, sloops. The most important thing were these, what they called the flat-bottomed boats. Each one of these has 60 soldiers on board. These could get in, land, shallow water. The British were used to getting up cliffs, handling difficult terrain. Battle of Quebec, they even hauled up a couple of cannon. So this gives you an idea of the kind of capacity they had. So why did it all go wrong? Here we go back to our old friends, Arnold and Andre. And this is, actually, I didn't mention it before, but this print is called The Tempter and the Traitor. And it's about as melodramatic as you can get, but you can see here the Hudson River. But what happened? Clinton, Sir Henry Clinton, everything was ready to go. One thing was missing from the puzzle. What if this was all a hoax? What if Benedict Arnold, the most famous general, fighting general under Washington, what if this was just a bluff? Maybe it was a trap to lure the British up the Hudson and then Washington was going to hit them. So the only way to be 100% sure about this was to actually meet Arnold in person to make sure this was what it seemed to be and also to finalise how the operation would go from Arnold's perspective. So Andre was sent up the Hudson to the sloop, the wonderfully named HMS Vulture, and from the Vulture he was rowed ashore in Haverstraw Bay below King's Ferry, and on the 22nd September, early in the morning, Arnold met Andre, and even Andre's got a very sinister expression here, and apparently he was this very charming, debonair, graceful young fellow. So they had this talk that went on for several hours, hidden amongst the fir trees. And they went on so late that rather than being rowed back to the Vulture, Andre went and stayed in a safe house overnight. Now, the intention was that the next day, he would go, on 23rd September, he would go back to the Vulture. The Vulture would take him down the Hudson to New York. Green light, the expedition would get off, go up the river. But it didn't happen. And it's one of these strange flukes of history that this was down purely to the bloody-mindedness of a fairly junior officer, a colonel, who didn't like seeing the Vulture anchored off his patch. So on his own volition, he got together a cannon and a howitzer and decided to bombard the Vulture, which meant that the Vulture had to drop downriver to Sing Sing, where the prison was later, and basically stayed there, which meant that Andre couldn't go back by water. Instead, he had to go back by land. He crossed over at King's Ferry and then went down the other side of the Hudson through what was known as the neutral ground. The neutral ground was basically a no man's land between the Patriot-controlled zone and the area that was controlled by the British garrison of New York. As he was passing through the neutral ground, Andre, Major Andre, was stopped by a patrol of militiamen. Now, even that wasn't necessarily the end of the story. Andre had a pass from Arnold, which he could have shown to these men, and that would have got him through. But he made the mistake because one of these men was wearing the green coat of a Hessian Jaeger, Hessian rifleman. Andre saw this and just kind of assumed that these men were loyalists. And he gave the game away, or he created sufficient doubt that they decided to get him off his horse and search him. Now, there's considerable debate, there was at the time and there has been since, as to what their motive was. Were they searching him because he looked like a gentleman and he was well dressed? And they later said they noticed he had these smart white-topped boots. So they stopped him. Now, when they searched him so thoroughly that they got him to take off his stockings. And inside his stockings were plans of West Point and other correspondence in the hand of none other than Benedict Arnold. Now, Andre had lost his composure at that moment, but he quickly regained it, because when he was taken to the local outpost commander, Colonel John Jameson of the Continental Dragoons, he had the persona of John Anderson, and he created sufficient doubt in Jameson's mind. Jameson couldn't believe that Benedict Arnold could possibly betray the American cause. So he sent Arnold himself notification that John Anderson had been captured. And at the same time, he sent the documents that had been found on Andre to George Washington, but they went by different riders. Now, Washington had been in a conference with the French at Hartford, Connecticut. One of the things that Arnold and Clinton were hoping to achieve by delivering up West Point was the capture or elimination of George Washington. And if you combine the capture of West Point with the elimination of George Washington, then I think you've got a bit of a double whammy going on there in terms of the revolutionary cause. Now, Arnold, on the 25th of September, is sitting down to breakfast with his wife Peggy and his personal entourage when the first of the messengers arrives with the notification of the capture of John Anderson. Arnold excuses himself politely from breakfast, goes out, saddles up a horse, rides the short distance down to the Hudson. Luckily, his barge crew on hand gets them to row him down to the Vulture. Not long afterwards, Washington arrives, and he knows nothing of what's going on, goes over to West Point, where he expects to see Arnold, because Arnold's headquarters was on the other side of the Hudson. Very surprised that Arnold's not there, comes back. And it's only when he's back, and by this stage Peggy is indisposed, that the second courier arrives with this big bundle of dispatches in the handwriting of Benedict Arnold. And the penny drops. Washington suddenly realizes that, oh my God, Benedict Arnold has gone over to the British. Sends off 2 officers, including Alexander Hamilton, by horseback to try and intercept Arnold as he passes through the choke point of King's Ferry, but it's too late. He's already reached the Vulture. Now, none of this would have happened if it hadn't been for that train of circumstances. The fact that Colonel James Livingston decided to bombard the Vulture, that André had to go back by land, that André lost his composure when he was intercepted, or even that André had decided to wear a pair of fancy white-top boots that caught the attention of the militiamen in the first place, caused him to stop him. So Washington was convinced that this was an act of providence, that somehow the cause of the Patriots was in the hands of a higher being. Now, I'll quickly go back. Major André, of course, and here is a self-portrait by André, which was made the day before his execution. He actually expected to be executed that afternoon, but the execution was postponed for one day because the British were negotiating to try and save his life. Now, André did this without the use of a mirror, and he actually gave this drawing to one of the officers who was in charge of the captivity detail. Now, André, as we know, was hanged at Tappan. He'd requested to be shot by a firing squad, but of course André was a spy, considered to be a spy. Spies are hanged, spies aren't shot. So if you shoot him, even though you're killing, you're somehow acknowledging the fact that he's not a spy. And if he's not a spy, you can't execute him in the first place. So, but Washington, interestingly, didn't attend the execution. Oh, sorry, this keeps on going too quickly. This, of course, although they couldn't actually hang Arnold, which they wanted to do, they did burn his effigy. And this is a German, interestingly enough. It shows how much this resonated. It's a German almanac, German language almanac for the Pennsylvania German population, showing the procession before Arnold's effigy was burned in Philadelphia. And this was a very elaborate effigy made by Charles Wilson Peale, the famous Philadelphian artist. And it showed Arnold with 2 faces, which there was a child, a small boy, was concealed in the carriage who worked a kind of a lever which made the head turn. And so these were very elaborate effigies. You've got the devil prodding Arnold with a pitchfork, and the devil's holding a bag of gold, which is where, of course, the whole greed, bribery bit originates. Ivan, sorry, that's my son's name. I kept on calling my son Benedict when I was writing my book. Now I'm calling Benedict Ivan. But, of course, there's West Point, there's the Vulture, and this is the quayside, the wharf side at Philadelphia. There is spy, traitor, there's André, and the other is the Joshua Smith, who was also involved he was involved, no one knows really how much he knew, but he was originally supposed to guide André back to the British lines, but he kind of left him out on a limb before he got him through to safety. And that is another factor which had a big bearing, because if Smith had been with André, André probably would have got through. So I'll just quickly try and wrap up. But it's often been said that this kind of reaction, the horror generated by Arnold's treason, was in itself decisive, because it somehow regenerated the patriot cause at a time when it was at low ebb. And people were so horrified that it created this momentum that within a year, Washington and his French allies had cornered a British army at Yorktown. The war was effectively over. But I don't think that was the case. although you have many popular demonstrations, not just in Philadelphia, but in many places, not least in Arnold's own birthplace, his effigy is burnt. That doesn't mean that thousands of men flocked to join the Continental Army. In fact, before they got better, things got worse. At the start of 1781, there were serious mutinies in the Continental Army. And it looked like, I mean, that was the real low point, when the several regiments from the Pennsylvania line and the New Jersey line, they mutinied because they were sick of the conditions. So I think if there had been this great resurgence because of Arnold, why would that have happened? So I just don't buy that. I think that Yorktown occurred very much because of the same luck, providence, if you want to call it that was behind the exposure of Arnold's treason. Now, I just want to wrap up very quickly because I've realised I'm kind of overrunning. But Arnold went on to serve the British towards the end of the war. He went on to fight in Virginia for the British and went on the rampage, basically, and it seemed that the American forces there could do very little to stop him. Later served in Connecticut. By 1782, he was in London. There, he met a kind of lingering resentment in a way, because the trial of Andre, Major Andre, had been covered in great detail by the British press, and there was kind of this animosity towards Arnold, because Andre, this popular, charismatic young man, had died, and yet Arnold had survived. So there was that kind of resentment. But he was greeted at court, and he was walked into St. James's on the arm of Sir Guy Carleton, who'd been a British general who'd been opposing him in Canada. And very interestingly, Peggy Shippen, Mrs. Peggy Arnold, of course now, gets a pension, an annual pension of £500 from the king. And she isn't a widow. You know, Benedict Arnold's still alive. What did she get this pension for? Now, it was obviously for something more than just being Mrs. Benedict Arnold. And in the National Archives in London, I found letters written by Arnold in 1792, where he was at pains to point out that Peggy's royal pension was earned in her own right, in recognition, and this is a quote, of the imminent danger she had experienced. Indeed, quote, it was expressly given in consideration of the sufferings she endured, the hazards she run. What were these hazards? What were these dangers? If Peggy hadn't actually have been involved in forwarding the treason, she wouldn't have been in any danger. This wasn't a reference to her being kind of out of favour with high society in Philadelphia after her husband defected. If she'd been actively involved, like someone like Anne Bates, in forwarding treasonable correspondence, then she would have faced very different consequences. Anne Bates, as her testimony shows, believes she would have been hanged. She wasn't from the same social class as Peggy Shippen, but Peggy Shippen certainly would have had, I think, quite severe treatment. Now, Arnold, when he was in London, the British lost their American empire, but at the same time as they lost their empire in America, they were building a new one in India. Arnold was very keen to be employed by the East India Company. The British Army was badly in need of cavalry, and the Indian rulers they fought against had very large forces of irregular cavalry. Arnold lobbied the British several occasions to let him go and fight in India, but they never gave an appointment. He also wanted to be governor of Dominica in the West Indies. Once again, they didn't allow him to go. He did in 1794, when he was actually trading in the West Indies. He got captured by the French revolutionaries, and he was lined up to be guillotined. But he escaped at the last minute and actually managed to reach the British who were fighting the French, and he was actually involved in an operation under General Charles Grey. Charles Grey had actually fought in the Revolutionary War. In fact, Captain Andre had been Charles Grey's aide-de-camp. So there's an interesting link there. And when Arnold escaped at Guadeloupe, he used the name Anderson, which had been the alias which John Andre had used during the Revolutionary War. Quite an interesting episode, which is really not included in most accounts of Arnold. Anyway, Arnold goes back to London. He dies in London in 1801. And there's an enduring story that Arnold, on his deathbed, had requested to be dressed in his old Continental Army general's uniform, which, of course, he'd been wearing on the 25th September when he was rowed downriver to the Vulture. So he would have had it. Wished to be dressed in it, and he is said to have prayed that he'd never taken it off. Basically, he'd somehow regretted his treason. Now, I think if you look at Arnold's character, I mean, this is just a story, there's no hard evidence for it. If you look at Arnold's character and the kind of this faith he had in his own behaviour, the fact that he was always right, I think that to the very end, there was no evidence that he felt that he'd behaved badly. I think he might well have regretted his decision in some ways, but it wasn't because he thought he'd done the wrong thing. Now, going back to the boot, this is at Saratoga Battlefield Park. And this is a curious monument because it's just a boot. And on the back, on one side, it has dedicated to the most brilliant soldier in the Continental Army. But it doesn't have a name on it. But of course, this is the leg that was wounded, the left leg that was wounded at Quebec, wounded at Saratoga in that pivotal moment. And there's the old story when Arnold was serving in Virginia, he was talking to a captured Patriot officer and said, "Oh, what would they do to me? What would you do to me if you captured me?" "Well, sir, we'd cut off that leg and bury it with military honours, and then we would hang you on a gibbet." We don't have an account of Arnold's reaction to that, but I like to think of him kind of cocking an eyebrow. So, really, this is a kind of, this depiction of the boot, I think, is interesting because it does, despite Arnold's heinous reputation, it does commemorate his crucial contribution to the cause of American liberty. And I think that's something to remember even today when his name is still seen as synonymous with turncoat and traitor. Thank you. Thanks. Sorry, Scott. I overrun.
Fantastic. Well, we'll probably have time for maybe two questions, but two points of order. We'd love it if you had time on your seats is a survey that gives us some feedback about the speaker series, allows us to hear your suggestions for readers or topics that you'd like to cover. And finally, there's lights in my eyes, so I can't see where you are, but I think, Tim, you're over here, and where's Veronica? I thought she was going to be here. Our representatives from Haverford Trust. So Haverford Trust is the sponsor of our Read the Revolution series, not just our bi-weekly online Read the Revolution, which is an email that you can actually sign up for on our website, and you'll receive every other week a curated excerpt with a little introduction to a book, like Turncoat, and then the Read the Revolution Speakers series here at the Museum of the American Revolution. So why don't we... Maybe we could take if there's a question, one on the side. Or should we sing? Yeah. How are you with show tunes? We have to give you a microphone, Phil.
One of the things that you moved over fairly quickly was the battles on Lake Champlain, and he was not only good as a soldier on land, he turned out to be a pretty good commander on the water as well, right?
Yeah, well, of course, as I mentioned, Arnold had spent several years as a merchant captain, so he was actually a very experienced seaman. And, yeah, he was commodore of the flotilla on Lake Champlain. And, of course, one thing I didn't mention is the fact that Arnold had actually lobbied for a naval posting. And after he'd been injured while he was in Philadelphia, and if he had have been given that naval commission, of course, it's possible to speculate that that would have A, given him a worthwhile combat role, B, because of the kind of prize money that you could get in the Navy, would have satisfied that aspect of his character as well. So I think if he had have been given an appointment by Congress to serve in a naval capacity, that also would have probably have diffused the tensions within his character that ultimately led to him defecting to the British. Although, of course, I don't know, I emphasised the ideological, what I see as the ideological grounds behind Arnold's treason. Perhaps those would have resonated still, but I do think a naval commission, probably you would have had another celebrated revolutionary admiral to add to the names we're all more familiar with. So yes, that's a very good point.
Yes.
Was not that significant. His decision. What was her role then?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, the lady is asking, picking up on the fact that I said that Peggy Arnold's role, Peggy Shipp and Peggy Arnold, her role wasn't significant in instigating the treason. If that wasn't the case, what was her role? So, obviously, I didn't have the opportunity or the time to go into detail, but Peggy, I think there's a fair amount of evidence. If you look at the actual documentation, there's evidence that Peggy was certainly aware of the treason. The Arnolds were an extremely close, affectionate couple. I think it's inconceivable that she would not have known. And John Andre, once Arnold had approached the British, he instantly saw Peggy Arnold as a possible conduit for treasonous correspondence. And there's quite detailed discussion about how this would be carried on, using invisible ink, using what they called interlining, using various codes. And because Peggy, I don't think there was necessarily a romance between Peggy and John Andre. In fact, I don't think there would have been, because it's the sort of thing that would have been picked up and considered scandalous by Philadelphian society. But because of that connection, she was seen as someone who would be worthwhile approaching. And a very good book on the treason, which covers treason throughout spying throughout the Revolutionary War, by Carl Van Doren. He looked at the evidence in great detail, and I see no reason to differ from his conclusion. And the evidence I found in London, which wasn't used by Carl Van Doren, which is the fact that Peggy was given a large financial reward, which was out of all proportion for simply being the wife, not the widow, but the wife of a defector. And also, I didn't mention this, but Sir Henry Clinton in 1792 refers to Peggy Arnold's meritorious services. What are these meritorious services? Keeping Benedict happy? Ironing his shirts? I don't think so. No, not everyone will agree. Another recent book on Arnold absolves Peggy of any guilt at all. But I just don't buy that. So, no. Okay. Yeah. 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 Well, she did. There's a... Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, I have to stick with the facts. And not everyone likes... I mean, I've been taken to task before. I wrote a book about Robert Rogers, and someone got in touch with me. Oh, I didn't like the way it ended. I said, well, yeah, and much as I'd loved him to have been, a rip-roaring patriot who went out in a blaze of glory, unfortunately, he died a drunk in London, and that's what happened. I can't change that. But yeah, historical fiction you can play around with. But just very quickly on Peggy, there's another incident I didn't mention, but Aaron Burr married a lady called Theodosia Provost, who shortly after the treason came to light, en route to Philadelphia, Peggy and her infant son stopped off at Theodosia's house in New Jersey. And initially, Peggy, who'd put on this great display of hysterics in front of when Washington's entourage were at Arnold's headquarters, to kind of, maybe it was partially genuine, but it seems to have been a bit of an act to try and deflect attention from the fact her husband had just gone off. Woman to woman with Theodosia, she basically said, oh, I'm tired of this facade, and just said that no, she had been kind of involved in it all from the start, and she was actively involved. So that story, there was great attempts to discredit that story by Peggy's Philadelphia family, because they wanted Peggy to be pure as the driven snow. But Theodosia Provost was a very intelligent woman. She was, and this was in the memoirs of Aaron Burr. Why would that story come out in the 1830s when it no longer kind of matters? To me, that has the ring of truth. And the young woman I spoke to, because that house is now run as a museum, and I think very few people know more about it and that story than the young lady who's the curator. I asked her for her opinion, and she said she thought that Peggy was in on it. So that's my take. Okay, well.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Stephen. We're gonna whisk Stephen to the table outside, where you have an opportunity if you'd like to have a book signed or ask any further questions. So thank you all.
Well, thank you.